Good afternoon, everybody. Please take your seats. We are about starting with the last session of the day. Again, welcome to all. It's a pleasure really to be here physically. I missed it and I think we all did. It's a pleasure to see a lot of old faces and some new ones. Welcome to everybody also who is listening online, hopefully numerous. And we move to the last panel. So the circular economy and critical raw materials, opportunities and limits. Of course, very important topic. I work myself in ADEA, which is the new European agency, which is tasked together with other executive agencies of implementing Horizon 2020. What's very important here, of course, is that we manage the raw materials part, the legacy of Horizon 2020, and the coming calls of Horizon Europe, which relates to raw materials, and in particular with critical raw materials. In fact, I am the project officer managing for the European Commission the project which organized this event, Screen 2. And I'm very welcome to give the word and the first presentation of this session to the coordinator of the project, Stefan Burke. He doesn't need a lot of presentation to most of you. He's been active in the field for many years, including managing the predecessor of Screen 2, the project Screen. He has a background which is technical. He's a chemist by training, but he had many different roles inside different institutions in France and within European projects. So he's of course best placed to give a presentation and to discuss this issue. So how circularity, the aim of moving towards a circular economy, goes together with the issue of criticality, which we are here to discuss. So without further ado, Stefan, please take your place at the podium.
Thank you very much, Igor. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, people that are physically here in Brussels, and to all the people that are connected to this event. I've heard that more than 300 people have been connected along the day, so I'm very happy to be here and present you about circularity, about circular economy, and about also the positioning of the recycling within the circular economy. Knowing that I work at the French Institute of Circular Economy for Low Carbon Energy, it's an institute from the French Atomic Energy Commission. So, just to enter directly into the topic and to deal also with the potential and limits of this recycling in the circular economy, I just want to remind you the link between recycling and independence. Very often we hear that with the recycling we can have a big independence in raw material supply. This can be right when the market is quite stabilized, when there is no increase in the annual demand, when the lifetime of a product is short and can be recycled very often and after a short timeline. But very often we are not in this case. And typically here, I show you the case of copper. Copper is not critical today. I don't know if it's good or bad. But the demand in copper is increasing every year. Not a lot, 3.5%. But what does it mean? It means that to provide us in copper for the next 20 years or 30 years, we would have to recycle 100% of the copper that has been produced since the antiquity. So you can imagine that it's not possible. This is 1 billion tons. And it's exactly the same amount that will be needed in the next 20 years, so between 2050 and 2070, again. So you can see here that just the recycling cannot supply everything, and with only 3% increase per year. For the critical raw materials that are very used in the technologies of today that we discussed this morning, like the e-mobility, the renewables energy, in particular the materials for the batteries, where we can expect an increase of about 15% per year. it means that the demand will double every 5 years. If we can expect a lifetime of about 15 years for a battery with the first life and second life, it means that when you will recycle them 15 years after their introduction on the market, this will only provide you with 12% of the demand. So the recycling is part of the market at a stable technology. We need to recycle, but we need to consider a global circular economy approach that starts at the mines and that ends at the recycling with many other issues in between. And in particular, when we deal with circular economy, there is a key word for us, it's economy. The circular economy is, first of all, an economy. And the economy means that you need to create wealth. And when we look at the value chain of a product or of raw materials, there is a very good example that has been shown by the development of China along the last 30 years. And here you have the example of the rare earth value chain. At the very beginning in China, they were just producing the minerals from the mine, and then they went to the production of materials. When they had the materials, they said, why not going to the components? And once they had the components, they said, why not going to the systems? So they started with the ores, they went to the oxide, then to the magnets, and now to the motors and the cars. And each time they went up into this value chain, they multiplied by 10 the value of this value chain. So starting from $4 billion dollars until $4 trillion now. So this is very important to remember the importance of this positioning in the value chain, and finally producing the raw materials is just the beginning of the story. And if we try to compare the recycling with this primary production, finally we could have such a picture. What was the minerals in the primary is the waste now. Then the materials is the market of the recycled nickel and cobalt. Then the components are the cathodes, and the systems are the batteries. And until now, even if things are moving, but maybe not fast enough, in Europe, we are collecting the waste. We start recycling this waste and producing the metals, nickel and cobalt, for example. But until we do not master fully the value chain up to the new batteries, finally we lose a big part of the value when we sell back our raw materials on the market, and in particular to countries that will sell us back batteries that cost maybe 10 or 50 times the price or the cost of the raw materials. So we need to keep this value in Europe. This is very important, and we need to keep this in mind. And to do this, we thought about a different approach of the recycling that is based on the golden circle defined by Simon Sinek. Today, the recycling that we very often discuss is that how can we deal with an existing waste? How can we manage an end-of-life product? And for this, we developed processes in order to, first a system to collect, to dismantle, to remove the different components, and then from the components to remove the raw materials. And what do? We sell these materials abroad in order to buy them again as a product. So we are losing the value when we are recycling, whereas the recycling costs a lot. Another approach is driven by the why. That is, by the product to be made. Why do we want to produce raw materials? And for this, we need to decide what are the value chains we want to focus on. And of course, you've heard this morning about the batteries, about the magnets. Okay, it's nice, but we need to have the plants that will fabricate the cathode active materials. We need the plants that will make the batteries with them. And with this approach, finally, what are the raw materials we need? Once we know this, we go back to the waste we have, and in order to determine what are the waste we have to reprocess in order to get these materials to make the batteries. So it's a totally different approach of the system that starts with the waste. We start with the product and we look at the waste we have today for the technologies of today. Of course, these two approaches are not mutually exclusive. We can find a balance between the two systems. What are the waste we have? What do we want to do? But we have to cover everything. And it is also necessary to ensure that the times and flows match and that the level of processing is adapted. What do we do with the material we recycle today? Because if we just produce raw materials, sometimes we will produce them under a form, a mineral form, that is not the one with the best added value on the market, or that doesn't necessarily answer the need of a market, or that may be of a too high quality compared to what they will be used for in the industry. And of course, the situation is very different depending on the metals themselves. The situation of the precious metals is different from the rare earths. Typically, today, the rhodium on the market is between 400 and 700,000 euro per kilo for a total production of 27 tons, whereas for the neodymium, it's between 25 and 40 euros per kilo with 30,000 tons a year. So you can understand that the process or the value chain that will be relevant for the rhodium is not the one that will be relevant for the neodymium. So there is no one model. You need to adapt your strategy to what you want to do at the end. Where will you create the wealth? And I put at the end an example that we made in our institute is the recycling of nickel metal hydride batteries, where we didn't try to separate all the metals from these batteries, but we directly produce a mix of nickel and cerium that can be directly used as a catalyst. So we don't sell nickel, we don't sell cerium, we sell a catalyst that is a much higher added value with a process that is adapted to this end. That is, we do not produce a very high product because we can directly use this mix. So this is an approach that is very interesting when it's possible. Of course, the objects to be recycled are complex, and very often the amount of materials that are strategic, are present in a very teeny amount in the components. Here you have the composition of a personal computer. You see on the upper graph that the very, very small slide at the top finally can be decomposed in the second graph below, and all of these are the strategic materials. So when we will develop a recycling also, we have to keep in mind the final goal of this. Should we recover all the value? What is finally the best process for the value? And there is an approach that I'm very kind of, is what has been developed by Umicore at Hoboken, where they totally use their background in the metallurgy of copper and the precious metals in order to adapt the head end of this process for the recycling of such complex materials, knowing that they just focus on their core business, that is the precious metals and some base metals that can be recovered together. So this is very important. And also, I would like also to warn you again on the risk of focusing too much on the closed loop. There is this very famous example of Solvay that developed in the mid-2010 or in 2013, they started a plant to recycle the compact fluorescent lamp because there was a big ramp up of this technology in the world, and the Erecon final report even pointed out the very interest for this recycling. And finally, just 2 or 3 years after, there was a total shift of the market with the LED lamp, and they had to close their recycling plant. And this was a very bad signal for the recycling industry. This is a very versatile system where you are never sure that your initial flow will last enough for you to capitalize on your capex. So this is something very important, and therefore we need more flexibility in the system, and it will be my conclusion. So recycling is not enough to meet the demand of CRM, especially when the demand doubles every 5 years. Collection, transport, recycling rate, dilution in complex variable systems are all barriers to the development of viable sectors. But new strategy must be developed at the European level, oriented around the circular economy, and in particular for us in France, the one proposed by the French Environmental Agency, ADEME, with Rachel here. That is something that integrates all the value chain from the sustainable sourcing, the eco-design, the industrial and territorial ecology, the functional economy, the responsible consumption, the lengthening the usage life, and the recycling. And of course, we need to diversify supplies from mine residues. We had the presentation of a project just before, industrial waste, end-of-life products, by maximizing all this secondary resource valorization. And of course, we need to develop processes that are cleaner, more efficient, and flexible enough to adapt to the variability of incoming flows, and not to increase the number of metallurgical plants, but to pool them. Keep in mind all the history we have from the mining metallurgy. We have to take benefit of all this knowledge and not to reinvent everything each time we want to recycle a very specific end-of-life product. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks to you, Stefan. Extremely interesting presentation. There were so many points which I'm sure raised questions, comments, or would invite to table a discussion. I invite the audience online to post already their question on Slido. It's open. We will collect them and reply them later. Or if you're here, please make a mental note or write it down. And at the end of the session, we'll of course open the floor for questions. I found it extremely interesting how you gave a systemic presentation about the issue of circularity in relation with criticality. This is also the point of view of this whole session. It's not so much about circularity as solving a single problem, a single waste stream, or looking at a single technology. It's about how systemic-wise circularity can contribute to solve the issue of criticality, and also the hurdles which we need to overcome to get there. A most stimulating one you mentioned is that we try to shift our economy. We want to go towards a zero-carbon digital economy. This is not a heritage, so all the waste streams we inherit from the past are going to be different, and then we will need to rethink all our systems. How do we make a recycled internal combustion engine into an electric car? Everything is going to be extremely challenging, bloody hard, as Vice President Timmermans said, in terms of the shift to a zero-emission economy. But we'll get there at the end of the discussion. I invite now the second presenter of the session, Alessandra Hull, who is the CEO of the Entwicklungsfonds Seltene Metalle, so the fund for development of rare metals. She will give us an international perspective to this. Of course, she looks at a global level rather than a simple European focus, as it should be. Very interesting, of course, the issue of circularity and rare metals, because, well, I think we all agree that base metals generally tend to be recycled. We do have challenges there, sorting the different sorts and so on, but it's a different level of challenge for rare metals. Just a few words about the ESM. They work a lot on criticality, as their name suggests. In particular, they are dedicated to fostering research and innovation in this field, both in terms of creating knowledge, which means fostering research in this area, including by giving grants to people who study it, but also organizing a network. And of course, it's also in this capacity that we welcome her here. Please, Alessandra, the word is yours.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm also talking to my function as a coordinator of the International Roundtable on Material Criticality, IRTC. And in this project, this is an international collaboration of experts on criticality. One of the things we're looking at is how criticality relates to the circular economy concept. And we have already heard by Stefan that circular concepts with a growing demand, of course, won't be able to fulfill all the demand we have, but it can contribute. And especially recycling, of course, can add to supply, thus increasing the supply base for economies or companies, but also the shorter loops of the circular economy, such as reuse or remanufacturing. By making products longer, we actually can help to reduce or limit demand growth to a certain amount, at least. There are specific challenges for the circularity of critical raw materials, which distinguishes them maybe a little bit from bulk materials. And some examples are here on the slide, such as we usually have small amounts of raw materials per product. That, of course, doesn't apply to all critical raw materials. For example, cobalt in batteries, that's large amounts, but often, of course, small ones. They're often not captured in circularity metrics when they are in small amounts there, when the circularity metric is mass-based. Often we have a high mix of different raw materials. There's a low value of raw material per product quite often, of course not in itself, but if it's there in small amounts in a certain product. The critical raw materials are sometimes used for mobile products that move, so the logistic of take-back is difficult. We have often a global dispersion of materials. There's a lacking standardization, also what Stefan mentioned, the very quick technological change that can also disrupt technologies, makes it really difficult to build up standardized take-back and recycling systems for certain materials. There's a loss by design, what we say when we have a high mix of materials, so that it's not made for a disassembly or recycling. The recycling capacities for specialty metals are often limited or concentrated, and some devices where critical raw materials are used it's easy to not return. So we heard that earlier with Fairphone, so you don't keep the fridge in the drawer, but a mobile phone you often do. But there are also some upsides. As you see, the list is much shorter, but there are a few upsides where actually there could be some specificities of critical raw materials that actually makes them a good target for recovery, for circularity. The material value is often high in absolute value per mass. There's no downcycling of metals. They get a certain political attention, so maybe we could target them more. There's an incentive to keep these materials as a strategic asset. And since they're often in the spotlight of environmental and social impacts, these can be reduced also by circular strategies. So in the IRTC project, we have built a model that looks at incentives, and we distinguish 3 incentives actually to keep critical raw materials in the loop. And the first is to stabilize the supply base. The second has to do with prices, so in order to have cost advantages or mitigate the price risks. And the third is the mitigation of reputational risks and or adherence to regulatory standards. Now, I want to show you 3 international examples of circular strategies for critical raw materials on a company level. We look at each time on 3 things. First is the specificity of the certain CRM we're looking at, then the business model of the company in question, and then actually the drivers for the circular strategy. And the first example is the internal rare earth recovery from hard disk drive, which is an example from Japan by the OEM Hitachi. So what's specific to area is, we all know that it's a high supply concentration and accordingly a high country dependency. What is the business model of Hitachi? They collect the magnets on the hard disk drive in a business internal structure, so they actually broadened their business model towards collection and also towards disassembly, and they disassemble the hard disk drive and actually return the magnets internally at Hitachi. And then they have two different strategies. One is an open loop recycling, so the recovered magnets are sent to companies outside of Hitachi groups for further processing and recycling. And then there's a closed loop recycling, where actually recyclers by Hitachi Group are doing the extraction and recycling into new magnets that can then be incorporated into new hard disk drives by Hitachi. So what's the drivers here? One of the strong drivers actually has been government regulation. There have been two acts that are named by Hitachi to be relevant there. One is a basic act on establishing a sound material cycle society, so it's about circular economy from the 2000. And there has been an act on specific kinds of home appliances recycling in 2013. So there was a strong regulation incentives and also some government support in order to stabilize the supply for Japanese companies, which then here on the slides I have tried to relate that to these three strategies. And today this works economically also for all subgroups of sub-entities of Hitachi in the whole value chain. The second example is from Korea. It's a lithium recycler called Sungil High-Tech. Here, as a specificity, we know there's a relatively large amount of lithium in batteries. We know there's one of the largest demand growth overall for critical raw materials will probably be lithium in the next years. And we also can observe that there's quite of a price increase at the moment. So what is Sungil High-Tech doing? They have a full process recycling where they recover all battery materials. They also, as Hitachi, have a closed loop recycling on one hand, where they have fixed contracts with OEMs, Korean OEMs, to do the recycling. And then there's an open loop recycling where they sell the recycled lithium phosphate. The drivers here are, according to the company, mostly to stabilize the Korean supply base for lithium. And also here the government was supporting the early stage R&D. And then the third example is almost a textbook example of a successful circular strategies for the CRM. It's the rhenium recovery from jet turbine blades from the US and the UK, namely General Electrics and Rolls-Royce. So the specificities of rhenium is among the rarest critical raw materials. It's quite expensive. It has a complicated supply by byproduction. And there's a really small market for that. And there has been a rhenium crisis in 2010, which probably most of you know, which have increased prices around the tenfold, which actually gave the incentive for these turbine manufacturers to make their rhenium cycle circular. So on one hand, these companies have a new scrap recycling methodology, so they do internal recycling of manufacturing scrap from alloy casting and from machining of casting components. This also includes very minor sources of scrap such as grinding sludges and used blasting media. Then there's a closed-loop material recycling where the rhenium is recovered and recycled from end-of-life engine blades. And there's also now one of the shorter loops, a component lifetime extensions by remanufacturing of blades in the form of rejuvenation repairs. Here the drivers were clearly the mitigation of price risks in that rhenium prices and at the same time supply stabilization. And this is a business model that works pretty well, and I think both of these companies were able to completely stabilize their supply. Now we try to look a little bit at the drivers and look at the commonalities of those and some other examples. And I think there's a few similarities which we can identify, and these are that circular strategies work better if the raw material value is high, if there's a closed group, a closed company group, if there are policy incentives, which we see in a lot of these examples, if there's full information on materials and processes, which of course relates again to this is easier if it's all the same company, in a B2B environment and within national borders. Now is, of course, the question, how could we incentivize these conditions or support them? And some of them are clearly something that must be done on a company level, such as vertical integration and so on. But other things could be done in company collaboration, such as data sharing, industrial symbiosis, or working together on new ownership models. And there are also certain conditions that can clearly be supported by policy, as we have seen, such as a recovery regulation, a framework for collaboration, for example, offering data protection between companies. There's certainly room for thoughts about raw material prices and environmental taxation, and also for labeling and marking best practices. Within national borders is of course pretty difficult to achieve when we have national raw material strategies. And for the examples we see, or for example, Hitachi did recovery as an example, but obviously only works for products that are sold in Japan, because they can be taken back with the logistics system on a national level. And so I think it's important to actually foster cross-national collaborations if we want to in global supply chains, if we are really aiming at the circular economy on a larger scale. Tomorrow there will be a workshop, and I don't think you can read the program very well. It's maybe a little dense. So it will be tomorrow here, and I think you can still participate online if you're interested. We'll have the 3 companies examples that I just showed, and I think it's 16 in total, so it's dense. So where we try to find different circularity strategies for critical raw materials from all over the globe, basically. And yes, and an according discussion if you're interested in that. And also, to finish, I would like to draw your attention on another project we're in. This is a massive online course on critical raw materials, managing resources for a sustainable future, which is currently running. And the reason I'm showing it is that this actually should guide learners from all over the world, ideally through the raw materials challenges, and then through different kinds of solutions on a technical, a circular, and a policy level. And in the end, we're collecting business ideas that actually should drive the learners towards thinking about circular solutions for critical raw materials. And the reason that I'm showing this is because I think it is nice to see so many learners from different countries and also different research fields being together in this learning environment. And we have these forums, and there's a really good discussion going on there, and I'm really looking forward to these business ideas. I hope we get some. So thank you very much for the invitation. That's it.
Thanks a million, Alessandra. Thanks, Alessandra. Another excellent and very stimulating presentation. I like in particular how you structured it across with examples, which gave a little of a feeling of the work you do, also in terms of spreading best practices and looking how different choices made in different countries and for different materials. Very interesting, for instance, to see that in one case, in the case of rhenium, the private sector was basically able to do it themselves. There was a strong economic incentive. They wanted to stabilize the price of a rare material, which is a byproduct of copper, and as such is a bit dependent on other cycles, which are not its own. And they managed to do it by collaborating between users, producers, and the airlines, which then use the materials with rhenium inside the products, the components. Very different choice, the one of Hitachi. We've seen that it was done inside the same company mostly, with a strong public support policy incentive to act in that regard. For, let's say, security of supply reasons, the Japanese government clearly wanted to ensure a supply, but also environmental. I'm sure that my policy colleagues will take good note of this. Very interesting, of course, also, as you mentioned, that there are many different ways of intervening, and probably a lot of work is needed to decide which is the best approach. Policy-wise, one could put a minimum recycled content in a product, might tax, on the contrary, the use of virgin raw materials, might regulate the process of recycling itself. So there are a lot, or give a premium to those who use recycled content. So there are a plethora of different options which have to be investigated, and your work supports, of course, policymakers around the world and here in Europe to choose the best approach. Now, last presentation of the day. At the end, we still have, let's say, an address, but it's not a technical presentation like the one you're going to present, Luis. A few words about Luis Tercer Espinoza. As you've seen also before, he was presented already, and he presented already himself. He's the head of business unit raw materials in Karlsruhe, in the Fraunhofer Institute. We know we deal with criticality, Luis, since a long time, because we've been involved from the very beginning into the criticality assessment and the critical raw materials policy here in the EU. When I was the non-ferrous metal, I remember in particular, for instance, the work you did on copper and the flows and how the different sectors are dependent on these flows. Extremely interesting work. You already presented about another sector, or let's say about a sector which is dependent on raw material, the health sector right now. You will present now a broader perspective. So please, Luis, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for being here on this very last talk of the day. This is a different talk compared to the two previous ones, in the sense that it is not a presentation of results. It's rather an invitation to engage with the SCREEN project, which is the co-organizer of today's event. So what are we doing in SCREEN? And this figure shows you the distribution of effort in the project. So I've simplified it. We have 10 work packages, but if you simplify it down to 4, the largest part of the SCREEN project is about providing data to the upcoming criticality exercise. And the thing about the European criticality exercise is that the way it was conceived back in 2009 was as a transparent exercise. So you can look up what the methodology does. There's the current report is from the JRC from 2017. You can pick that up and read it and understand what the methodology does. And then if you look at the exercises themselves, you can look at the data that went into it. So that's one of the features of this exercise, and updating this data is a huge effort. So if you go and look at the list of candidate materials, it's very long. So we're looking at over 80 candidate materials. If you pick up that criticality report, the report itself is comparatively thin, and the annex, where all of the data is, that had to be split into 2 parts because it was just hundreds of pages per part. So updating that data, that quantitative data, and also the qualitative data that's specific to each raw material is the largest part of SCREEN. And that's that one big chunk that you see here on the left. And organizing that data and gathering that data is, of course, both a matter of looking at publications, looking at statistics, but also gathering intelligence from experts. That's why the project is the European Expert Network on Critical Raw Materials. And managing that network and growing that network is also an important part of this project. And of course, having such a large project, you need to do some good management and also have some outreach into the public. We just launched an outreach campaign right now that's not directed at experts and people sitting here, but at everybody sitting at home and maybe not having any idea about what metals do for the products and services that we enjoy. But once you're done with that, once you have all of that data, all of those numbers, and all of those qualitative statements of let's have more circular economy, let's do more recycling, let's do more mining in Europe, and let's engage with third countries and so on and so forth, you may be overwhelmed by the amount of data and the numbers themselves. You know, what does a very large number in tons tell you? What does a very large percentage of expected demand increase in technology X, Y tell you? Is it important? Is it unusual? Because things are happening all the time and changing all the time. So we're going to try to pick a few slices of that and provide a bit of perspective in there and try to help interested decision makers better understand or better get into the relevance and the importance of this data. And the way we're doing this is within the Screen project. We have one more package in which pretty much the whole consortium participates, minus the management. And so we're taking input from the network, because the network is a living organism. We're taking also some input from flowsheets, from work package 5, and we have a regular review process. We have a proposal of what we want to do across the whole 3 years. But we review that every half a year within the project itself and also with DG Grow to make sure that the proposal that we made 2 years ago when we wrote that is still makes sense. And the outputs are conceived as a series of working papers that are meant to be digestible. So we are aiming for 20, 30 pages maximum, whereas in the previous Screen project we had hundreds of pages and very detailed in-depth reports. So we're trying to just make it really more accessible and picking up the slices that we want to highlight. So right now, this is the timeline of it, so we're spreading it over 3 years. That should be an 18 in the middle, so it's month 1 to month 36 across the entire timeline of the project. Those are the 10 work packages, and I've color-coded them. So the green ones are the ones that you can expect to see in the coming weeks and months. And I'm going to talk about those in just a minute. Then we have the blue ones. They are picking out a slice of these issues that we are talking about. So there is one on policy related towards primary supply. At least that's the plan. We are going to also look at secondary supply and policies. We're going to look at this interaction between critical raw materials and the circular economy, much like we heard just earlier and from Stefan and even earlier today from Fairphone. And also looking at technologies. And then the orange ones, those are conceived as integrated reports. So here we want to go from the beginning at the raw materials all the way to the end of life of products, and close that loop just by picking a particular sector or a particular set of products. So the first one is going to be led by EIT Raw Materials, and we're going to be looking at vehicles. Not just any vehicle, but vehicles are not becoming only electric, they're becoming more connected, they're becoming cleaner by a variety of ways. We want to look at that value chain from the raw materials for those vehicles over to the preparation, so the processing of those raw materials, and then the making of the vehicles themselves, and then the circular economy aspects, and then again the recycling and coming back to those raw materials. And here in these orange ones is where the consortium really comes together, because we have experts within the consortium and within the network that can deliver interesting perspectives on each one of these pieces. So we're trying both, pick a slice of the economy and look at all aspects, and pick a slice of the raw material world and look at one aspect. So let me show now 3 examples, those 3 green ones that I showed you just before. And the first one is about supply. And we hear, and it's right to speak about, the need for more primary supply from within Europe. It makes sense. If we have the resources and we have the technologies to really exploit that natural endowment, then we should do it in a way where we can be sure that it's done in a good way, both socially and environmentally. So this first working paper goes into this pillar of supply, that's domestic primary sources of critical raw materials. We know that most are imported, and we know that recycling is important. But in this one, we just want to look at this domestic supply. And the way we're approaching that is a number of, the Year Geo surveys is a partner, in the project, as are a number of other geological surveys within that umbrella, and also BRGM, which is leading this particular report. And with the help of the other Eurogeo surveys, they're updating a map of sources for critical raw materials in Europe, potential sourcing. And so there are a number of projects behind that are delivering that data. The last one of them that's closing, well, that we are going to take in, is closing early next year. And on the basis of those projects, there is this new version of a map that's going to be generated. This is the last one. So they're updating it with the newest data. And the idea is to get this map of deposits in Europe, what is there, what could be coming out of European geological deposits, what timelines, what is most promising. So trying to go from just a general call for mining in Europe and trying to make it a bit more precise. These are actual potentials that have been characterized up to now, and this is what could come out of it. That's the first one. The second one is looking at demand. And again, we can't look at the overall demand, but just selected sectors, and within those. This work is being led by CML, the University of Leiden. And what they've done is they've collected data from recent reports. And there's a selection of 11 technologies in 3 key sectors, and looking at those and what the expected raw material demand are for, looking out at 2040. So at the very top, you have the report, and then you have different sections going into transport with 2 technologies, energy 5 technologies, and the EST or the ICT sector with 4 technologies. And then, having seen those, you can come back and sort of bring them together. And that's interesting because we had the question this morning about the interconnections. When do sectors kind of compete for the same raw material? So of course, if you want cobalt, and we all talk about batteries, we cannot forget that if you have hard tools, based on tungsten carbide, the glue that's putting together those tungsten carbide grains is usually cobalt. And if you're making some special superalloys, then you have a lot of cobalt-based alloys. So those sectors do compete for the raw materials. So we find those technological links leading to some common raw material requirements, which is something you would expect. But in the report, they are highlighting it just by looking at it more in detail. So each individual sector actually has to look beyond its own boundaries, beyond its own raw materials, its own technology, to find the potential competitors for those resources. And then also, again, we pick up a little bit of the circularity potential there, but again, we have to bring it into perspective of how much can they do. So increasing lifetimes brings a much quicker and much larger impact, as we saw this morning, that, say, going all the way to recycling, as Stefan showed just now. The last report is about deciding what is critical itself. And critical is a wonderful word, and it is incredibly intuitive. If I say critical to you, there is immediately some sense of what I mean that sort of grows in you. But it's, of course, this intuition is also a problem, because when we say critical raw materials in the EU context, there is a particular meaning to it. So what is critical for a particular company or for a particular sector is not necessarily what the EU would include in its lists of critical raw materials, because just the view is a different one. So in this last working paper that's coming up soon, the very first step is revisit that logic to try to explain what the thinking is behind that criticality methodology. Why is it what it is? What is it doing? And then takes a deep dive into the indicators and their aggregation, and also a lot of decisions and assumptions that are made there. And then we want to propose some simplifications, maybe some fine-tuning, if we find something that's worth changing. So the very original version of the methodology, again, is from 2009. 2010, there was a process there. After 2 sets of studies, there was the need to revise it. This was done 2017, and we had, again, 2 sets of studies now that could be done again, and that's where we are right now. And of course, we're not going at the core of, we're not at the core of the methodology. We think the core of the methodology really does work, and that is looking at the risk out of the sense of the concentration of supply that seems to be working very well. It's also a common element. Everybody else that has written a quantitative methodology following the EU and following the qualitative and first arguments that were set out in the US in 2008 by the NRC, those really take that concentration of supply as a central feature that seems to work pretty well. Just think about, we talk about rare earths, we talk about magnesium, and then we talk about China only because if something happens in China, then it will have large repercussions across a number of value chains. See magnesium right now, for example. And on the other hand, we have this economic importance that focuses on the value of the product, not on the value of the raw materials themselves. We think that also works really well. It's a matter of how is it being taken, and we are going to revisit that, and that's going to also come up in the coming months. So with that, that's the end of my preview for these three reports. I'd invite you to get in touch with us if you want to be involved, to visit us also at the website. There's here our contact at screen.eu. If you write an email to that address, it will find its way to the right person. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion just now or afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis. And very nice presentation, and I liked in particular you framed the work of the project we are here representing inside the broader criticality issue and all the issue of supply of raw materials you mentioned, which are considered in your work in Screen and are part of the work we perform. We move quickly to the question session. As you hinted, there will be cocktails afterwards, but we still have a round of questions, followed by a nice presentation by Guillaume Pitron. First of all, if someone inside the hall would like to ask something to the panelists, looking around, feel free to intervene also later. You can just raise your hand and we'll give you the word. But I've seen that online people already prepared some questions, and the first is to Alessandra. Do you think that increasing nationalism, also in Europe, can hamper the EU Green Deal and the energy transition? Very nice question. Indeed, there is a growing resource nationalism around the world. And how do you think this will impact the policy making, like the EU Green Deal, or more generally, the energy transition?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's a big question. I would say yes.
You have 3 minutes.
Yeah, I think there's definitely at least a danger. So there's two things. There's increased resource nationalism, which has been a topic, for example, in WTO cases already years ago. And then there is an upcoming nationalism also within Europe, but also between other countries globally. And this is first the resource nationalism, and then there's also nationalism that makes it really hard, as we all know, to take common action towards climate change, for example. And although, of course, it's important to look at domestic sources, yeah, I think trade will be important in the future, and it's important to work together, I think.
Thanks a million, and of course that's an encouragement to proceed of the international framework of cooperation rather than blunt nationalist competition. Of course, the EU will always be for open and fair markets in raw materials. At the same time, of course, we also have to take care of the criticality issue, so to make sure that this openness does not translate into risks which are not acceptable for our economy and for our society. Some other comments about this by the other panelists, please.
Yeah, just what you said. Yeah, just wanted to add that on top of criticality for nations or national sectors, there's also a criticality for global sustainable development. I think we shouldn't neglect this in the debate.
True, very true. Very often these exercises are done at national or, in the case of the EU, let's say, let's say geographically continental level at most, but not really in terms of international criticality. And probably this is something missing also in the academic assessment. Very well, let's move to the next question for Luis. Could you specify if the mapping of materials that you described takes place in the context of the actions foreseen in the EU critical raw material strategy? Well,
easy one, yes. That's the short answer. I mean, of course, this is a drawing. Screen is a support, is coordinating and supporting action. So we cannot do much new research on our own. We're profiting from the actions that are being made in the context of Horizon Europe, for example, in the context of the work of the partners or on the work of the network. And the project is also designed very interactively. So the original plan that we had is already not quite valid, because when we wrote the proposal, for example, this 10-point action plan that Milan showed today wasn't published yet. I mean, of course, they were probably already working on it, but nobody told us. So we had to change our plans as we go, and that is why there is a periodic review process every half a year about that we have with the executive, with the committee within the project and with DG Grow to make sure that the actions are aligned with those strategies. And as the Commission keeps doing some new things, then we need to keep adapting to make sure that the reports and the input that we're generating is not just repeating things or going against decisions that have been made, but keep contributing to the discussion.
Perfect answer. Very well. This is the link, of course. Screen 2 is a project which fits into the context of the work and the EU critical raw material strategy assessment and so on, but exactly as you illustrated. Second question, again for you. Will you consider in your mapping existing research studies providing estimates for unused products in addition to the database you showed? Unused products.
I'm not quite sure I understand this one. In the reports that are coming up, that are in the immediate pipeline, this is not a part of it. So we're looking at supply from geological sources within the EU. That's the first report. We have reports coming out on circularity. We may pick that up. There have been projects within Horizon 2020, Horizon that have looked at this already. So the sources are there. If you think this is an issue that should be highlighted more, then do get in touch with us. Again, we have this periodic reviews. You just need to convince the right people that we should look at it more.
Yes, if I interpret the question a bit, probably it's about the stocks versus the final raw materials provided by recycling. So basically, what's available there in a product which is still in use. Of course, how much will be available later on, which is a very interesting point, I think.
Agreed.
But
that's a good point, but there is a very good, there's a large effort going on right now within the framework of the Raw Materials Information System, and also sponsored by DG Grow, to map these things in so-called MSA, so Material Systems Analysis. And the very basis of that are material flow analysis for Europe that look exactly at this. So how much is in stock in use and how much is flowing out of that stock. Because again, going back to the thing of perspective, it's not the stock in use that's the resource that's available. You know, nobody goes and tears down a building to get at the steel and the copper. You wait until you don't need the building anymore. When the building is torn down, then you get at the steel and the copper. And so this distinction is an important one, but there is already a lot of data being generated and collated and systematized by JRC on this.
yes, and indeed, I also think that policymakers are very much aware of this, so they try to align the coming regulations about the products which are currently in use but will be recycled in the future. In some cases, as you mentioned, they have very long lifespan. So also from the point of view of my agency and the work we do have projects which try to develop the technology for recycling products which will come massively on stream as recycled, it's to be recycled, like windmills, many decades from now. So indeed, an important issue, but we are aware of it, let's say. A question by Eberhard Falk. To all, so you might choose to reply, otherwise I will appoint one of you to reply. There is also an ethical question that has bothered me for a while. Should or will we force people to surrender unused items? I think this refers to the famous issue of the cell phone in the drawer, but more generally to the fact that not everything which is available gets really into the recycling. Please, Stefan.
Yeah, I think that we have to force the people, but by some clever mechanisms, I would say. And in the circular economy, there is one very important pillar. This is the economy of functionality. That is, if what you have is just rented to you, or if you have an interest to return it, you will contribute to this circular economy. Mm-hmm. There are many examples that are not very new. In the past, when I was a kid, I do remember that if you return the glass bottles, you had some 1 franc discount on the new bottle, and this is something that we have to push for. The returnable fee is very important. You know that on a SodaStream bottle, it's 30 euros. 20 euros are for the returnable fee. Mm-hmm. So with this, finally, somewhere you are forced to surrender your unused objects. And we have to push for this economy of functionality that we find in carpooling, car sharing, the fact that Xerox does not sell photocopiers anymore, but photocopies. The fact that if you think of, you have a drill maybe at home, the average use of a drill per year is 12 minutes. So maybe it's more interesting to rent it when you need it than buy it. With all of these approaches, I think that the people or the consumer will follow this strategy, but we have to better communicate. We have to teach the consumer and to make the consumer responsible of their action. They have to really decide what they want and what they do and understand the system. We have seen not so long ago that NEC produced a TV screen showing 68 billion colors. Your eyes can see 10 million. Okay? So if the consumer is responsible, maybe he will not buy such a screen, but only one that is adapted. And with all of these approaches, we will save raw materials and we will find mechanisms where people will be happy to return their unused object that somewhere will force them, but because there is an interest and not maybe a tax, but a grant.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Emilio, Stefan. Indeed, this is something which we should push more for. There are some simple examples which work excellently. You mentioned the bottles when you were a kid. I think of the Pfand system in Germany, which works very well with a lot of bottles or other type of containers. I think in some cases the new economy will help us a lot there, now that many producers keep basically the rights to their product, so they have an incentive to get it back at the end, be it a car being on loan rather than being simply purchased, or many other of these new economy systems. This is something that we really need to think about to make it easier, convenient. In some cases, I think we could investigate the possibility of the seller being forced to accept back the products at the end of his productive life in exchange for a new one. It is start to be done for electronic products, but there are probably many different approaches needed. I think the question raises very well the issue, and then it will be up to us to find a way for every single waste stream or product stream to act. I'll take another 2 questions, then I promise I'll close here our panel. There is a question about deep sea mining. Do you think that the EU should push for more deep sea mining to supply the materials we need for the energy transition? Well, it seems a broader question. Of course, we know that many of these materials, which are deposits at the bottom of the sea, are critical raw materials, which is what makes them often economically interesting to be recovered. Quick answer on that?
Quick and difficult.
Tough topic.
This is one of those things that is qualitative, you can say that makes sense. And what I'm going to say now, it's a very personal opinion, and it's actually more of a warning. We tend to disregard things that we do not see. A lot of mining and a lot of heavy industry that has left Europe has left beyond our sight, and so we are not seeing anymore the consequences, that the inevitable consequences that mining has, and some of the things that we could have been prevented if it had been done under reasonable conditions, legislation, and societal oversight, because it's not here anymore. And I see personally an even higher risk of going astray in the deep sea, because there we can't even go visit. We would need, you can't go and go out on a trip to Bolivia and see how the salares are doing. You can't go out to China and see how the mine in Bayan Obo is doing, but you would have to go and you would see the sea, and it would be kilometers below the surface. And I think there's going to be a lot of care necessary to do that in a way that we're not destroying things that we don't even know exist with the methods that we have at hand. But again, that's just a personal opinion to this. I don't think there's I haven't heard a definitive answer on that.
Thanks. Of course, this is not an issue we can solve here. There are also huge, of course, international, let's say, responsibility issues, because the high seas are a bit, do not fall under the usual mining regulation we have. So indeed, as you say, it's difficult not only to see what happens, but also what, under which framework of regulation it could be done. The people who support it, of course, will tell you that, and I think Guillaume in his presentation will tell us something about that. You should compare it with the practices right now that happen to get rare earths, for instance, and to concentrate them. So long discussion, regretfully. We can only hint at it right now. Very well, last question, and sorry, Luis, it's again for you, but I think it's quite an easy one for you as a specialist of the CRM methodology. The question is about the fact that the methodology was derived for minerals, and if it is suitable for biotic materials as well. Well, there are some materials which are not minerals inside the list of the materials to be assessed under criticality, but you can maybe expand a bit on this.
Yeah, also not that simple. I think we could discuss that one at length. If you focus on the issues that the methodology is trying to address, namely the concentration of supply and the value that the raw material brings to products in the EU, then I would say yes, it's a fair way of assessing them. Drawing a line between biotic materials and minerals and metals particularly has been a difficult thing. So in the very original one, biotics weren't included. Then there was a recognition they should be included because they're also raw materials. Some of them are imported. They have some similar issues. In a way, they're fundamentally different. So, wood does grow on trees. But if the trees are only in certain parts of the world, then you have, again, the same concentration problems. So there are pros and cons. I think basically it works. This is a particularly good case for going to those annexes to the methodology, to the report, where the actual issues behind the raw material are described. Because you're comparing, it's not comparing just biotics with metals, you're comparing industrial metals with precious metals with, non-precious but technology critical metals, and so on. So we're comparing a lot of very different things there, and I think the core of the methodology does work for all of them.
Thanks, Emilio. Well, thanks everybody. I'm very sorry I see there were additional questions, but it's my duty as the chair to keep the time. We need now to thank our panelists. Round of applause for them. And now I think we can go back sit at our places and enjoy the presentation by Pitron. I'll introduce him very quickly. For those active in the sector of raw materials, of course, he's quite a well-known name. Lawyer by training, but journalist by vocation. And he wrote two excellent books which are very important for us. One, you found it is a kind of homage of the project Screen 2 at the entrance. His previous book, which was The Rare Earths Wars, were investigated with a lot of detail and a lot of interest in on-the-ground experience, as a good journalist does, how rare earths are gained and what really happens in those very opaque markets. And he will, I'm sure, refer back to his first book, but now in particular we've focused to his new effort, The Digital Hell. So he will explain what happens when we use, put a like, to put it simple, or in general when we use the digital media that we are so used to take for granted without considering the raw materials implication behind them. So what happens in terms of the materials, the energy, the system that needs to be employed to be able to use them. Thanks a million, Guillaume. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm very pleased to be here again in front of you for about a bit more than half an hour to tell you a bit about the book that you've been having on your hands earlier today. I'm a journalist, I'm a documentary maker for the French TV, and I have been fascinated by the rare metals and critical metals issue, and I've been willing to write the book, The Rare Metals War, that was published in France in 2018 and then published in 12 countries, including in English, for the last years. And this book is about all the topics that you're aware of. Where are we going to get the minerals for the green energy transition? And if the green energy transition was not that green at all, and what new challenges are we going to meet? And the book was quite a success in France when it was published. And at some point of the book, I also make a point about all the materials that are necessary for a phone and for digital technologies. And my editor said to me, my publishing house said to me, but why don't you turn these 3 pages into 300 pages? Why don't you do a specific world investigation about what's material in a virtual world? And for 2 years, across 4 continents, I've been doing a new research that was just published in France. And this research is called L'Enfer numérique in French. It's Digital Hell. And the subtitle is On the Trail of a Like. And basically, for these 2 years, I've wondered what's happening when I send a like, or when I send an email, or when I send a picture of my vacation to my neighbor in the office next to me. And a like or an email is a very embodiment of our digital lives. It's a digital action that we perform every day, but we don't really figure out what's happening when we just like someone's profile on Facebook. And we don't realize that we mobilize an infrastructure that is set to become the largest thing that the human species will have ever built in its entire history. It's an infrastructure made of, at the same time, terrestrial cables, submarine cables, maybe tomorrow also more satellites. And I wanted to tell this story. So I'm not going to tell you about the Rare Metals War, the book that you have, but I'm going to tell you about the second book, which is set to be published in several countries next year, including in English. Basically, I just want to remind you of the fact that everything that we do in the physical world leaves a trace in the digital world, in the internet infrastructure. Whether it's governance, industry, smart grids, buildings, whatever we do leaves a trace somewhere. So our lives are not only today physical, our lives are always, almost all the time, digital. And this is what I want to talk to you about. And the like or the email is just an embodiment of all of these kind of things. And basically, when we speak about these digital lives that we have, we mostly have in mind nice words and nice objects, whether it's about the cloud or it's about the virtualization, dematerialization. Everything seems to be unreal in a way. The phone we have in our hands, the iPhone, is a beautiful object. It's actually been designed by Apple, but Steve Jobs, the CEO of Apple at the time, was very much found into Buddhism aestheticism, Zen, Japanese Buddhism aestheticism. He considered it was a perfect aestheticism on earth, and he wanted the phones to look like actually a Buddhist temple in Japan. Very simple, very aesthetical, very virgin. And what we have into our hands is a beautiful object, and how such a beautiful object can actually be dirty at the same time. And I think this phone that we have is counterintuitive because it doesn't allow us, it prevents us from understanding all that the pollution that is being produced in order to make this phone happen, and all the pollution of the infrastructure itself that will be mobilized by our iPhone when it sends a digital action, a notification. And for the last years, several branches of the UN have actually pushed forward the message that digital technologies and environment come hand to hand. It was said back in 2017 by the UNCTAD that global CO2 savings resulting from efficient use of ICTs is estimated to amount to 15% of global emissions. And 2 years before, actually another report by UNESCO was saying mobile technology alone could lower greenhouse gas emissions by 2% by 2020. And that makes complete sense. I mean, if I don't send a postcard, but I send an email, obviously the CO2 gain can be expected to be very strong and then can be good for the environment. The thing is, in 2019, there is a research by a French research institute, whose name is the Shift Project, who came up with a radically different answer to that. And it was said, among other things, that the digital transition in its current form does more contribute to global warming than it does to help prevent it. So basically, when we start to try to calculate and to go into more details into the researches regarding the environmental impact of digital technologies, well, nobody really knows. And in fact, the question being, IT for green, for sure, but does green IT exist? And especially, what is the balance in between both? And actually, no one is able to answer today because there are so difficult figures to find. The estimations are extremely difficult. When you want just to, put forward a figure, usually you get always criticized because everyone will disagree. But obviously, the question is today more complex. Obviously, IT brings something to the environment. It also costs to the environment. And this is that balance that we need to figure out, and also the dynamic of that new form of pollution, this new chapter of human pollution that is being studied now. Don't forget that the Greta generation is going in the streets on Friday thanks to hashtags and YouTube videos. And there is a paradox here. On the one hand, this generation wants better things for the environment, but on the other, this generation is accelerating such kind of digital pollution. And I see a paradox, and I ask a question. Will the Greta generation will be really the climate generation? I think that's a bit of a provocative question, but I think it's worth questioning this, because when we see the acceleration of this pollution, it is obviously a very important topic for the next decades. I just want to tell you about the interfaces, the phones that we have within our hands, and the kind of pollution they produce. Obviously, this is a chapter that you're already really aware of. And then I'll move to data centers, cables, and I'll mention then, and lastly, the solutions for greener digital technologies. Let me start first with what's in our phone. Obviously, I will not remind you about all the various metals that we have into a phone. Also, I want to remind you about all these figures. You are very much aware of them. The total percentage of the world production of antimony, dysprosium, gallium, indium, terbium, that we find for various digital applications, whether it is magnets, integrated circuits, lighting, flat planet displays, semiconductors, and all these kind of things. But as you see, very large amounts of some specific materials, metals, are being used for digital technologies, and this figure tells us about the amount in tonnages that it can represent when building, when manufacturing phones, tablets, and other computers. Obviously, everything needs to be recycled, and once again, I don't teach you anything here by telling you that it depends on critical raw materials and raw materials being present in phones, but it's going to be very difficult to recycle a large amount of them because, as you know, it's economically not, it is not rewarding from an economic viewpoint to recycle them. We shouldn't forget that when the phones in the 80s were containing only 10 critical elements, and then in the 90s the phones were featuring about 30 critical elements. And today, in the years 2020-21, a smartphone does contain up to 60 elements. And because a phone is not only used for making a phone call, it's used for meeting someone on a dating site, it's used for ordering a taxi, it's used for making a phone, making a video call or to take a picture. And this is going to make those phones even more complex and complex by the day, with more metals to be used into them, with more ecological impacts. What I really want to insist on is a study, several studies that have been conducted for the last years by German researchers of the Wuppertal Institute in Germany. And this is studies deals with what we call the MIPS, the material impact per service unit, also called the butterfly effect of a matter. And basically, these researchers are absolutely fascinating because they come up with the very idea that the objects around us are far bigger, far greater than we imagine. Let's assume that I have a book within my hands. What amount of matter, of raw materials, have been necessary for making this book come alive? Not only the size and the volume of the book, as you know, but much more materials, because for making the book come to reality, there have been needs for growing forests, cutting trees, there has been some electricity needs, oil needs for making the various forest industry work. The book has been obviously transported until here. So basically, this butterfly effect of the matter takes into consideration all the different materials that have been mobilized to make a book possible. And when we look at whether it's a book or about a T-shirt, or about a newspaper, or about a pen, we come up with a ratio of the final weight of the product and what has been mobilized during all the life cycle of the product. This ratio can be from 1 to 10, 1 to 20, 1 to 40, 1 to 100, 1 to 200, 1 to 300, and more actually. When we look, for example, at a simple T-shirt, which is just 150 grams, actually the amount of material have been 1,000 times more important than the final weight of the T-shirt. And this kind of ratio can be replicated to many other objects around you. But when we come to actually phones and even for integrated circuits, this figure will be even higher. As you know, these phones are made of various raw materials, especially rare metals, so-called rare metals, not very rare, but very much diluted into the Earth's crust. And extracting them, refining them, and actually featuring them into a phone will explain that the ratio between a phone, the MIPS ratio of a phone is 1 to 1,200. So basically, the final weight, your phone, your smartphone that you hold within your hands is probably not 150 grams, but 150 kilos, or maybe even more, maybe 180 kilos. And that's even more true with an integrated circuit. It's so complex to manufacture an integrated circuit. If the globalization had to be synthesized through only one object, I would choose the integrated circuits because it's so difficult. It features so many subcontractors on all the value chain to make a ship possible. And the MIPS ratio of a ship is the largest one, is the strongest one we've ever seen, with a ratio of 1 to 16,000. which means that a ship is not 2 grams, a ship is 32 kilograms. And, you know, we are within here in this hotel with speaking with experts on the subjects. You live in the raw material world, and you might be aware of this. But let me tell you, when I go to the media in France and I speak to that, people are just completely amazed, and they had never thought about this material impact of the material world. And when we speak about that, when we understand that, we come up with a couple of conclusions. And the first thing is, there is no such thing as dematerialized technologies. And we keep talking about this dematerialization stuff, but when we want to dematerialize, we actually replace one matter by one another. We replace paper by metals. And at the very beginning of the history of dematerialization, the birth of the writing was a way to dematerialize the physical presence of the people. In Mesopotamian times, 5,000 years ago, the moment there was a writing possible, I could pass an order without being physically present. So the writing and the piece of paper or the piece of clay on which the writing was made was actually a way to not being physically present and to let an object say something instead of me. So that was the beginning of dematerialization, and then it ended up, I mean, it's been changing and changing over time, and I don't have time to speak about that right now, but basically it comes up with a new way of not dematerializing paper by tablets or phones, but replacing some specific types of raw materials by other raw materials. But the more interesting thing is, when we turn to these digital technologies, is that the more interfaces are miniaturized, the greater the physical legacy. So basically, the more your phone is small and discrete into your pocket, the better, the bigger actually the physical legacy is. So the more virtual we go, the more material it is. And the more virtual we want, the more virtual the world we create is, the bigger the physical impact of it will be. And that's something very counterintuitive that it's only starting to be understood by the general public when you speak about that. There is another thing which is counterintuitive. Information travels at the speed of light, but its impact continues over time. Information goes into the cables at 200,000 kilometers a second. It's absolutely instantaneous. But when you look at the impact of the mining, and as a journalist, I've been in the mining areas in China notably to see the rare earth extraction, the graphite extraction. Let me tell you, this is a scar in the ground that will stay for a while, decades, centuries, and maybe more. So there is something counterintuitive here between the immediacy of our lives and what remains after we have used information. And the last thing I want to stress is that all things virtual confront us with our planet's physical limits. And we think that thanks to virtuality, we're going to be able to make coincide our growth, a better prosperity of our societies, and on the other hand, a better protection of the environment. Well, I must tell you, I'm not very sure about that. And I would like to really question these ideas that virtualization and the protection of the planet come hand in hand. Actually, this is a wonderful tool, digitalization, to accelerate a new business. This is a data economy and all these kind of things. And that will probably, in my view, will accelerate the confrontation with the planet's physical limits. The thing is, what have I done? Okay, this is blocked. Yeah, thank you very much. Once you have sent a like from your phone, once you have so you use your phone to send, I've said like or an email or whatever. And what's happening here? Actually, this digital action will be passing through data centers, and I want to make a point here in the data center world. Well, first let me tell you what happens in a minute in internet in the world. We don't realize how huge it is. We scroll 1.4 million times on Facebook. We swipe 2 million times on Tinder. We do 5,000 downloads on TikTok. We send 69 million messages on WhatsApp. These few examples examples tells us how important our digital actions can be on the web. But when we send a like, well, basically I get back to the idea of following the route of a like. The like will actually go through the 7 layers of internet in order to go from one phone to one another. So basically the 7th layer is your phone, and the first layer is the physical infrastructure of the web, including the backbone of internet, which is the cable infrastructure. And in the meantime, the like will go through the 5 other layers of functioning of internet. But basically, let's make it simple. I have my phone here, and I want to send a like or a message to you on the second row of this stage. Basically, we're 5 meters away from each other. The like or the email will not go from my phone to your phone. It will probably go to the 4G antenna on the roof of the hotel. Then it will go down our feet under the sidewalks. It will find its way through copper cables down our feet, find its way probably through submarine cables on the shores on the coast of Belgium, and then it will cross the Atlantic Ocean if it's an email that is being, for example, sent on the Gmail account, will go to the United States, will be replicated into several data centers, and will come back actually on the other side, on the other way around, through the Atlantic Oceans, and will arrive in your phone. So basically, my email will not just go 5 meters, will not travel 5 meters, it will travel thousands of kilometers, and actually we're just very close to each other. So basically, once again, I get back to the point, the human species is set to build the largest thing it has ever built on the human history in order to make our digital life possible. And that really questions the very idea of turning our world non-physical, virtual. The data centers basically, once an expert said to me, we don't realize, but actually we're using every day for our digital actions about 100 data centers every day. These data centers are basically servers which are being gathered into warehouses, and this warehouse can be as small as a cave, and it can be as big as 1 soccer field, 2 soccer fields, 3 soccer fields, and the largest data center in the world is actually the surface of 110 soccer fields, and this data center is located south of Beijing, 1 hour south of Beijing. So I've been told about the cloud, and I end up with 3 million data centers being everywhere in the world which are actually absolutely necessary for making our digital lives possible. And this map tells us about the big hubs of the data center locations. Lots of hubs are being actually in Europe, as you can see, Frankfurt, London, Dublin. Also in the United States, because it's been historically, as you know, the center country for the development of the internet infrastructure, but also Asia, obviously. So basically here, you can see the geography of a like, the geography of a clicking, the geography of sending an email, or of going on a website to check the next recipe for your child. And this geography that is very counterintuitive and also fascinating. What does it look like? Well, I've been on the field to travel to see what a data center looks like. These are not my pictures, but on the right side you can see typically what a data center looks like, and you have racks right and left, and you have allays like this in huge warehouses where you have all the servers working. The first time I went into such a place, it was very fascinating to hear the servers which were actually making noise like a bee, and I had the feelings that I had entered like a huge, like I had disturbed 100,000 bees at the same time, because everything was making so much noise around me. I realized that I could listen to internet. You can hear internet, you can taste internet, you can touch internet, you can feel internet, but you can also listen to internet. And one of the biggest places for actually storing the data, a place in the world where 70% of the world data go every day, is the city of Ashburn, which is 1 hour south of Washington, D.C. on the east coast of the United States. And this place, seen from a satellite image, you can see actually all the storage houses, all the data centers being gathered here in this specific place. And the data centers, industries, Equinix, Amazon Web Service, and Microsoft Azure, and all these companies offering storage services come specifically here because this has been historically a place where the internet industry, the storage, the data storage industry has been gathering, but also because the electricity is cheap and available. Where does the electricity come from? The electricity comes from nuclear power plants, natural gas power plants, oil power plants, wind farms, solar farms, coal power plants. I was there in May, last May, so basically I said to myself, why don't I go to the Appalachians, a couple of hours away from these data centers, to look at the way the coal is being extracted from the mountain. And on the left side of the picture, these are not my pictures, but you can see a typical action for actually removing the top of the mountains of the Appalachians to extract the coal. So on the right side of the picture, you see what's actually after the extraction activities, what the landscape looked like. The coal has been extracted, and part of this coal will be used for making electricity, and part of this electricity will be used for turning the data centers and making the data centers work all day long, 24 hours a day, 7 hours a week, 365 days a year, because the sun cannot set on the internet. We are so much pressed to live on the internet all day long that the internet infrastructure needs to work all the time. And that comes at a huge electricity price and at a huge CO2 emission costs. And when we look at the red graph on that picture, it tells us basically that due to electricity consumption of the data centers notably, but also the electricity consumption of the mining activities for making the smartphones, probably the amount of CO2 emissions of the digital sector are somewhere between 3.7 and 4% of the world's CO2 emissions. This is more than the civil aviation industry today. So all the planes up on the top of our heads today are about 2.4%, so we are more than that. And given the dynamic of the explosion of our digitalized lives, this could be up to 7.5% by the year 2025, and this figure were furnished before the COVID-19, which have made our lives even bigger. So I'm very thrilled to see the next study, hopefully soon, with the updated figures. But there is a solution, and the solution is very simple. The servers are actually producing heat, 60 degrees, and half of the electricity of the data centers is used to actually cool artificially with climatization the data centers. But what if we send actually the data centers and the cloud and our likes and our friends on Facebook to the up north of Europe, in Sweden, in the city of Luleå? Actually, over there is free cooling. The free cooling is everywhere. You just basically open the door of the data center, you let the free air come into, and basically you don't need to have any artificial climatization. And that is wonderful because that helps reducing the use of electricity, and that is also a good way to use clean and green electricity because over there it's hydropower electricity. So basically what I did, I took a train from the capital city of Sweden, Stockholm, and for 12 hours I took a train in the middle of the snow, and I went to see the data center of Facebook, which was built for us, if you have a Facebook account or Instagram account or a WhatsApp account, in the north of Sweden on the left side of the picture. So I tried to see my friends. I tried to meet my friends because all my friends over there on Facebook actually stored over there. And I'm not only here speaking to you when I'm on Facebook, I'm also connected all the time, 1,000 kilometers away up to the north with this data center in the middle of nowhere. The picture on the right side is a picture from Mark Zuckerberg when he visited the data center a couple of years ago, but it's impossible to get in as a journalist. It's very hard to get an authorization to get in. So I couldn't get in, but obviously there is a solution here to make the internet greener, but that was before this. That was before Steve Case, which is a very high figure of the internet world in the United States, the founder of the AOL company, published in 2017 The Third Wave. And The Third Wave is a very fascinating book because basically Steve Case tells us during the first wave we connected the computers with each other. And during the second wave we connected the humans with each other thanks to computers. But actually we're coming, and he says, towards the third wave where we're going to connect everything. We're going to connect animals, we're going to connect trees, plants, vegetables. We're going to connect objects. That's going to make IoT, the Internet of Things. But we're going to be much more ambitious than just doing IoT. We're going to do the third wave. We're going to do the Internet of Everything. And Cisco company plus Steve Case are announcing the upcoming of the Internet of Everything, where everything will be connected, everything will produce information. As you know, we are moving today towards a new age of the data economy. Data is information, data is power, data is money, and this is a new oil, and the algorithms are the new machines that will turn this oil into wealth, into more profits. And we are going towards this new world at such a speed that it easily makes it understandable the explosion of the amount of data that we're going to produce in the next decades. We are going to produce in 15 years, in 2035, 45 more data, 45 times more data than the data we produce today in 2021. And today, we produce each day in the world more data than all the data we have ever produced since the beginning of humankind until 2003. So we are in this world that we can hardly understand, where the data will be everything, and everything will be made from a technological viewpoint, economic viewpoint, political viewpoint, to accelerate towards its world with new impacts, obviously, to be expected. So the question is then, will the infrastructure itself be able to actually support this explosion of the data production? And regularly we have university and engineers explaining that at the pace of explosion of this production of information, it's not sure that the cables will be able to actually make it possible to just sustain this. But actually, this is false. And this is what I want to talk to you about the cable industry. But basically, as you might be aware, 99% of the information doesn't go through the air, it goes into the oceans. And whatever we do, we are linked with each other by tires, by these cables, which are everywhere. And these cables, like they are today, 450, 500 cables. In 2030, there will be 1,000 submarine cables that are being laid and deployed everywhere around the Earth. And as you can see on this map, a global map of the big internet highways. And these cables are so powerful because inside you have 4 pairs of fibers, 8 pairs of fibers, 16 pairs of fibers, maybe tomorrow 32 pairs of fibers, that make it possible to sustain the acceleration of our virtual world. And basically this map tells us about where the most important submarine cables are. You might say, why are the cables actually into the oceans and not into the Earth? It's because per kilometer it's much less expensive to actually deploy a cable into the sea than to dig a hole into the ground for the same distance. So basically it's more interesting to have a submarine internet infrastructure. But this is getting deployed and deployed and deployed, and this is making the internet infrastructure extremely robust, extremely strong, and there's no way, there's no possibility for this infrastructure to be actually breaking up at some point. I just want to add a word about the geopolitics of that. Very interesting to figure out that we are talking about critical infrastructures that needs to be protected. I just want to attract your attention on a cable whose name is PEACE, for not peace only, but for Pakistan, Eastern Africa, connecting Europe. This is a cable that starts from from China that goes through Pakistan, that arrives in Gwadar, a port of Pakistan, and goes through Marseille in the south of France, and it will be arriving very soon, within the next weeks, in Marseille for connecting China to Europe. And the Chinese, thanks to this digital Silk Road, this is the way they call it, want to connect to Europe in order to offer new services, new Alibaba services, new Tencent services, and also for the Europeans, that's a way maybe to connect to the Chinese more easily. But there is geopolitics here coming up because this infrastructure will need to be protected. And I think, and this is a question which is being asked by very interestingly by American think tanks, is will the Chinese deploy actually their armies on the pace, on the trail of these cables to protect them? And will it bring more tensions, more military tensions in order to protect this cable, but more generally to protect all the cables that are everywhere on Earth? Same for the European-made cables or the US-made cables. But there is a geopolitics of our virtual lives, of something that was supposed to be untouchable, immaterial, and this is very interesting. I just want to end up, I've been a bit longer than expected, by telling you more about what could be done in the future to make greener digital technologies. And when you ask this question to people, you find as many answers as there are experts of the green internet. So it's very difficult to figure out what a greener internet could look like. So basically, you see people and you hear people, and I have called them the techno-entrepreneurs. You say more technologies will be a way to actually find a solution for finding to lower the environmental impact of these technologies. New raw materials, new alloys, and also new storage technologies will actually make it possible to accompany the growth of our data with new techniques which will make it in a way which will be much more environmentally friendly. On the other side of the spectrum, you find those who are the frugal and resilience. And you may have heard about the makers, the do-it-yourself movement. There are lots of them in Amsterdam. I've met a lot of them. But people who believe that the resilience of this internet and also greener internet lies into relocalization of networks and also artisanal way of repairing the phones, the tablets, the computers, and a simple way of life that comes along with a relocation of the networks and a more like a community way of living, very far away from the values of the techno-entrepreneurs. In the middle, you have Europe today. People, planet, profit. We have to find a good balance between everything. And then we start hearing a very interesting sound, a very interesting voice. I've called them the dark green governments. But basically, at some point, if we really want to make the internet greener, we'll have to stop using it, or we'll have to use it in a different way. You've seen recently maybe in the news that the China state has actually forbidden the teenagers less than 14 years old in China to use certain social networks more than 3 hours a day or 3 hours a week. That you have to be an authoritarian regime to be able to take such a decision. But that question actually, the way some states are taking actions in order to actually put limits and even to forbid some people to access the internet, potentially, it's not the reason why the Chinese did it, but potentially in a better way that could be tomorrow a justification for turning the internet greener. And that is very interesting and probably very dangerous to think that at some point some of these decisions could be made, especially when we see this from the perspective of we Western countries, where we have associated so easily internet with freedom of action and liberty. So basically, no one exactly knows what is the future of internet. Once again, I think that questions our actions, but especially that questions the teenagers generation today, the young adult generation. What will the greater generation do out of these technologies? They could do the best out of it, they could do the worst out of it. Nobody really knows, but this is a fascinating challenges that are coming along with these new technologies. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Merci, Guillaume. Thank you very much, Guillaume, for your presentation. We have about 10 minutes at the maximum for exchanges and questions with the audience. I have 2 comments on Slido, but are there some reaction in the room, question in the room before? Here? No, I don't see. So, Roland. I think we will do it at the old-fashioned way. I will come back to you. This is not very thankful for the people at the camera because they have to follow us. But
thank you very much for this very fascinating, very good talk. So my name is Roland Gauss for EIT Raw Materials. I just wanted to make one comment to really understand these global dependencies and raw materials needs and footprints. There's actually a great need for even better data on impacts by raw materials, advanced materials processing. Matter of fact is that we all use these materials, you know, in these most sophisticated devices, but we actually know very little, very often, about the footprints of these materials. So it really matters where your cobalt comes from. Is it, you know, what part of the world it's from? How is it processed? It really differs. Same for aluminum, magnesium, all these materials. So just as a comment, so you talk a lot about data, which is in the impact of data, and yet again, you will also need more data to tell the story even better and more holistically. So, but it's a great work. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I forgot to insist about the fact that there is a good internet, there is a bad internet, there is a good data, there is a bad data. That is a data that is necessary for making the environment better. Blockchain technology can be absolutely wonderful for actually, more tracing the materials. Blockchain technology can actually make it possible to invest more in bitcoins. What is the very social use and use for the better of the humanity of just investing in bitcoins? So I think we are, I agree with you, I should have added this nuance. These technologies and this data can be used for the best, for the worst. The question is, do we, what do we decide? We just take everything as a total, or we decide that we are going to insist on some specific uses and actually disregard those others? But I agree with you.
Yeah, to continue on the same topics, there are 2 comments on Slido. So how much data are really used at the end? And perhaps we should rather produce and collect fewer data and think whether they are needed. So this is the first comment. And this, yeah, so first, I don't know, yeah, I let you react on this. Where is the good compromise? Where is the balance?
I have no idea where is the balance, and I don't know if anyone knows. That's such a difficult question. Once again, I think we're not going to use less data. It's just impossible. Some people talk about disinformatization, just stopping to digitalize. It's just impossible. I hear some people speaking about sobriety. We should be more sober in the way we use the data. But being sober means probably going back to the way we used the internet 10 years ago. Nobody will want to go back to this time, and that's probably not necessary and not something that is good either. So basically, I can hardly answer precisely this question. It's such a hard question.
So typically, how long would it have taken to you to write this book without the digital hell?
It would have taken much more years. It would have taken, if I didn't have the internet, I would have probably not been able to add 1,000 footnotes to the 300 pages. So obviously, I recognize myself, all my contradictions. I go to the media and speak about that in France, and I just expect that people will retweet on the Twitter what I've been saying. So I recognize that everything is contradictory. I tend to hope that maybe what I'm telling you is worse the pollution, right? On the other hand, some other uses are just not absolutely unnecessary. But this comes to being a political and social debate. What is a good data? What is a bad data? If you come at the way out of a connected hospital and you ask the people who just get out of it, are you agree for actually keeping a brainwave for the connected hospitals? They're going to say yes. And if you go to a college, the way out of a college, and you ask the teenagers for what usages the brainwaves could be kept, they will tell you for TikTok, because TikTok made my life much more easier during the COVID times for keeping a social interactions with my friends. So people disagree on what's good and what's bad, and this is what makes it very difficult. But my point is to say, it's nothing about technology, it's all about it's getting social and political, and this is where such a debate is leading us. We don't see it that way today, but I think this is where it's leading us in the future. Technologies can everything. There can be no limitation to the acceleration, the multiplication of internet and the data. The question is, in my view, are we ready to cleverly bring to the table this debate of what's a good internet, what's a bad internet?
I try to move around the questions a lot as arriving all along we speak. There is a point maybe you have not addressed in your book. So you mentioned the cables, you mentioned the data center. This morning we discussed about the 5G. Have you got some information about all this electromagnetic radiation that are more and more covering our cities, knowing that today in France, for example, using the Wi-Fi is forbidden in low classes, except in a work exercise. So, did you find information on this?
No, actually, I didn't go into this debate. I understand that this debate is being asked. Basically, 5G is just about geopolitics. The question is, are we going to remain sovereign from a technological viewpoint, from a data sovereignty viewpoint, with our own 5G device and infrastructures towards China and the United States? I mean, this is, in my view, the only question that matters at the political level. So the question of the environment here, or the sanitary impact, has just been completely disregarded. And suddenly, and we've seen that in France and probably also in your countries, some local debates and national debates have occurred saying, but basically, what about the environment? What about the impact of on my brain? But this question suddenly came back, but after all, the first question was just geopolitical. Now this question is being asked, and we hear lots of people being very worried about it, and I think they're being worried because the debate has not been addressed by the politicians. So the debate comes back through the window, but people add to that their worriness. I wouldn't say whether it's good or bad for the brain to have 5G radiations. I just have no idea. What's sure is that what use will I do of my phone and of digital devices in a 5G connected world? I would probably could spend my days with a virtual reality mask on my face. I could go to the metaverse and spend my days in the metaverse promised by Mark Zuckerberg. With what effects on my brain on being connected all the time. And I think this is where I see this question interesting. Not the direct impact of the radiations on my brain, but the impact of my brain on my psychology of being even more connected than what I am already today. And we see these debates coming up, the impact on the attention of child's capacity to concentrate. This starts to being a big thing, and tomorrow it will be even bigger because 5G will make this connection even more possible, even more accelerated.
We go to the last two questions because it will be time to go to the cocktail and continue the discussions also. Is part of the answer for understanding the raw materials we use every day a link to trusted structured data, perhaps an industry-level database of materials?
It is disappeared.
No, because it moved to the validated.
Is part of the answer for understanding the raw materials we use every day a link to trusted structured data, perhaps an industry-level database of materials? I'm not sure I get this question right.
Either me. Is the person in the room, or can you reformulate on Slido? The time I move to another question is, that are not maybe in the archives already.
What I haven't said, maybe that's a link to the question. Just the manufacturing of the phones and all the interfaces accounts for 50% of the pollution of digital world, 50%. So obviously, where the action could be structured is basically on making our interfaces last as long as we can. We should use less phones, as it's been said actually by Fairphone this morning, and the longest time possible. And this is where we can really have an impact on lowering the pollution of the internet. Everything is about the materials, much more than the data storage.
Okay, and the last question that is a little polemic, and If you don't want to answer, do not answer, but we are here in an event organized by the European Commission. This is the Raw Materials Week. In the document you presented this morning, in the different sectors, the EU, the EC is pushing to go more and more to digital, but in parallel also here, we are pushing to consume less and less raw materials, even less and less critical raw materials. So here again, how can we do? If we push more digital and want less materials, what's the future?
I think this is such a huge paradox. And I agree with you, this is a very difficult question. And this is where I see the EU Commission being the people, planet, profit, triple P kind of state. We want to address every different issue, the environment and also the economic progress on the other hand. And sometimes these two different questions may come not together, but actually may confront each other. And honestly, I don't have the answer. I'm not a post-growth, not degrowth. I don't believe this is a solution. I just realize that these questions are extremely difficult to answer, and that at some point, the debate over lowering certain usages of internet and also lowering certain usages of the linear economy will come along with also the growing of other sectors. So there should be degrow, but there should be some degrow at some point on specific sectors that are actually too polluting. And this is what the technologies, the digital technologies can help to do better with less. I don't know if that's going to be sufficient. You know, the European Environmental Agency just published a report, very interesting one, saying circular economy will not be sufficient. It's necessary, but it will not save us like this. It's going to be much harder to actually make it possible to find a balance between all these contradictory goals just with circular economy. So I think we're ahead of very, very difficult questions. Sorry not to be more precise, but very, very hard questions need to be asked, and I think we are not ready yet for asking such radical questionings.
Thank you very much, Guillaume.
Thank you
very much also for coming, for preparing this intervention. I know that you are very busy. You took the time to have an English presentation of your book. It's very nice. We can continue the discussion at the cocktail. Thank you again. Thank you to all the attendees here. Thank you to all the people that are still connected to this online event. Thanks to the data centers. Thanks to the wires that cross the ocean.
That's true.
I hope that we have people in China, in the US, in Canada that are here with us together tonight. See you tomorrow if you attend another event. But for the moment, I propose that, sorry for the people that are online, but for us at least, we can move to the cocktail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you very much.